Now, there was a young man who stood in front of his older brothers. He was describing every detail of his dreams. And he could see in their faces a very present distaste for every single word that he had to say. They already didn't like him very much, and they made that obvious. They had trouble hiding it. He was their father's favorite child. He was somewhat sheltered from the real world, but not completely naive to things. This young man, Joseph, continued his description almost impulsively as his brothers glared in hatred at him. And they looked on at this beautiful tunic that he wore, a gift from their father for their favorite son. In Genesis chapter 37, let's turn over there to Genesis chapter 37. Here we have some of the story of Jacob, his father, who was also called Israel. Verse 1, now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. And you can just tell that, the brothers aren't going to like that very much, on top of everything else. Now, verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. In some translations, it says a coat of many colors. And it seems that Joseph wore this coat, or this tunic, a lot, maybe everywhere that he went. Now, this coat was meant to be a special gift from his father, but it seemed to only cause problems for Joseph. How is he supposed to make peace with his brothers who already hated him while he's being put on a pedestal by his father? Now, the dreams that he had were very vivid, and the meanings seemed very clear to everyone else, but were they in fact from God? I'm sure that he wondered this, and his siblings and his parents wondered that as well. And they doubted, they couldn't figure it out. Did they really mean that his brothers would one day bow down and worship him? Would his parents be brought lower than him? Is that truly what these dreams meant? You can see, when we look at the situation, we can see that this might have been, for a 17-year-old, this young man, maybe a point of pride. Was he filled with pride over this? And is that why he wore this tunic, this coat of many colors, around everywhere that he went? Now, this was no doubt a great temptation of pride for a young man. We don't have that specifically described here. We're kind of reading into things a little bit. But we do see that soon Joseph's character would be tested in ways that his brothers didn't even conceive of. Now in Genesis 37, here as we continue on, we're going to read some of this story here. Joseph was, he was hated by his brothers, and we see what happened. Joseph had been sent by his father to go check on his brothers to see if everything was going well, to see if they were causing more trouble listening to their dad, but also to see if they had all the supplies that they needed. And he searched them out. They had gone to a different place. If we drop down to verse 17, we break into this story. And there was a man that Joseph had seen, and he asked him if he'd seen his brothers. And the man said in verse 17, they have departed from here, for I heard them saying, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. In verse 18, now when they saw him afar off, you can imagine, they're looking out and they see this coat maybe shimmering in the sunshine. They see this kid, their younger brother, walking toward them. Even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. This is how much they had such a distaste for their brother, for his dreams, for his coat, for the favor that he received above them, regardless of whatever they had done. Verse 19, then they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming. Come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. Terrible. They plotted to kill him at this point, and they were serious about it. They were grown men they felt capable of making decisions for themselves. Now, thankfully, there was at least some sense of honor in the eldest brother, Reuben. And he made sure that Joseph wasn't killed. He persuaded his brothers. Now, the first thing that they did, though, after they decided they wanted to do something, if they couldn't kill him, they were going to help him out a little bit. So they eased his wearied mind, and they tore that tunic off of him. They took that colorful coat right from him, that representation that he was that favorite son, that their father looked on him differently than he looked on them. Now, the brothers did end up throwing him in a pit. We know that part of the story. And when Reuben wasn't looking, they sold him. They sold him to a group of some of their distant cousins, kind of interestingly. And they were on their way to Egypt to make a profit. Reuben wasn't happy with this at all. He had planned to take his brother home because he wanted to try to honor his father. And he knew that wouldn't honor his father. Now, it wasn't just, for the sake of Joseph. Reuben didn't like Joseph either, but he was trying to, at least at this one attempt, try to do what was right in the eyes of his father. Now, Genesis 37, we can read some more of this story as we continue on here in verse 31. So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? I see they're kind of hinting around too. They're not directly lying. They almost forced their father to guess what happened. And he guesses that his son is killed. He recognized it, verse 33, and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. So they didn't even mention to their father what had happened at all. They kept it a secret. And Jacob tore his clothes. He put sackcloth on his waist, and he mourned for his son many days. So we have this expression of mourning that was common at that time. Verse 35, and all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. So whatever plans the brothers had to get rid of their brother so that they would be in a better light with their father, it wasn't working, because now their father was just mourning for his favorite son. But what a sad state of affairs here that we see. This family torn apart by pettiness, by pride, by anger. But little did they know that God had used their bad attitudes, their mistakes, to work out his own plans to save their very lives and to test the hearts of his people. Now, if there was any pride in the heart of young Joseph, that would be tested as well. There were tests, there were trials that he was about to go through that would make anything in him come out to be known. I've titled this message, Temptations of the Coat of Many Colors. Temptations of the Coat of Many Colors. And we're going to look at some of the major tests that Joseph was put through in Egypt. And we'll see how he made it through each of these trials, these tests, these temptations. And through these same tests, we can look at how we experience these tests in our lives. And hopefully see how we can make it through each one of them as well. Now, Genesis 39. We'll skip the story in Genesis 38. It's not directly relevant, although it does show some of the character of Joseph's brothers here, some more of Jacob's sons. But in Genesis 39, we pick up the story of Joseph. Now Joseph, in verse 1, had been taken down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites, so their cousins, who had taken him down there. So he's been purchased by this important officer who works almost directly under Pharaoh. In verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hands. There was no doubt some sort of conversation between Potiphar and Joseph at a certain point. Because maybe Potiphar was wondering, why are you so successful? But it seems evident that it was known that Joseph worshipped a different God than the gods of Egypt. Verse 4. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. It didn't matter what he did. Whether he knew how to do it or not, he became successful at whatever it was. Thus, in verse 6, he left all that he had in Joseph's hand. And he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. So we see that Potiphar didn't have to worry about anything anymore as long as Joseph was on the job. All he had to worry about was eating his breakfast. That's it. He probably didn't even have to bring his bread to the table. He just had to pick it up and put it in his mouth. That was it. And it says, we have this little note about Joseph that leads us into this first trial. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Now this first test that we see Joseph go through is a test of loyalty. A test of loyalty. Joseph had earned the trust of a very important man, as we've seen, Potiphar, the captain of the guard. As we read, Potiphar saw that success that God had given to Joseph, whatever he touched. He trusted him to run everything in his house, except for bringing that bread to his face. At verse 7 of Genesis 39, and it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me. So we see this decision here that Joseph is forced to make. It's because he was so handsome, apparently. But Joseph had to make this decision. Now he could have lain with Potiphar's wife. He could have made that choice, and they could have easily have covered it up, made sure that Potiphar didn't know what was going on. They could have made sure that nobody else talked about it. This was a test of Joseph's loyalty. More so than a test of his sexual purity, it's a test of his loyalty. First of all, loyalty to Potiphar. That's obvious here. Verse 8, but he refused. Oh, he passed that test. And he said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. He's trying to explain that he has this trust with his master, and he is loyal to Potiphar. There is no one greater in his house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. So he's expressing that loyalty here. Now Joseph had a deeper loyalty than to his master, his physical master here. He had a greater fear than the fear of his master's wife, to make his life miserable. And that's what was up against him. Ultimately, for Joseph, this was a test of loyalty to God. And we see that at the end of verse 9. How then, he says, can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And sin against God. Joseph had already seen how God had spared his life at least once. And he caused him to prosper wherever he was. He saw that direct blessing from God. And no doubt he had heard his father Jacob's stories of his own life. Joseph knew that it was God who had brought his family to where they had lived and sustained them. And Joseph knew that God was mightier than any woman or man or any of the gods of Egypt that the people around him worshipped. And the household of Potiphar knew where he was from, and they knew that he worshipped a different God who was different than theirs. And they understood that. But they didn't have that same loyalty to God. Verse 10, so it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. This is something that happened, it sounds like every day. Every chance that she got when they were alone together, she would try to get him into bed, to lie with her. Every day, this same test of loyalty that Joseph was up against. Verse 11, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. By the way, that's the second garment that Joseph lost, that was forcefully taken from him. Just a note there. It's kind of interesting. We can track this through here. And he ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, see, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. So she's throwing everything on Joseph. Nobody was around to see it. She's Potiphar's wife. Why shouldn't they believe her? And she continued on, he came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. So she's claiming that she is being loyal. Now she repeats this story over and over again. And she even repeats it to Potiphar. And it happened in verse 15 when he heard, or this is the wife continuing on. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she repeats this story over and over again, so many times that people believe her. To me, it sounds like she was just embarrassed that Joseph didn't accept her advances. But ultimately, this wasn't a test of Potiphar's wife. This was a test of Joseph's loyalty to God. And Joseph remained loyal to God, even up against the consequences that would be there, that could make his life as a prisoner, as a slave. Well, he wasn't yet a prisoner, he was about to be a prisoner. That would make his life as a slave, as a servant, very difficult. Now, we are often tested in our loyalty. In fact, very often. It's easy to remain faithful to God, or attempt to remain faithful to God, when other people are around. It seems to be easier that way. Sometimes because we're worried about what other people think of us. We're trying to hold up our reputation. And we're supposed to withhold our reputation. Other times it's because we gain strength from the examples of other people. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But our loyalty to God is constantly tested through obedience when no one else is around. That's when our loyalty is tested. This is when God sees our true character. This is when he sees if we're going to follow his instructions. He sees our integrity as Christians, our loyalty to him. And when we sin, it's against God. But when we obey, we are loyal to him. That's our test, the test of our loyalty. Now, the second test that we see Joseph going through, so the first one was a test of his loyalty ultimately to God. The second test is a test of faith. A test of faith. Genesis 39, we'll continue on here. Verse 19, so it was, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. He didn't stop to ask Joseph any questions. He's a dutiful husband. He sided with his wife over his servant. I don't know, does that make him a smart man? In some ways it does. But he didn't stick around to find out what the truth was. Verse 20, then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison. So here we have Joseph in prison. Could you imagine being put in any kind of prison for something you didn't do? That'd be terrible. And Joseph didn't get a chance to defend himself. He couldn't go to court. He didn't have his day in court. He wasn't innocent until proven guilty. It was, well, you're guilty. Good luck. That was it. I'm sure the truth eventually came out, maybe when Potiphar saw Joseph's success later on. But at that moment, Joseph was faced with a test. This wasn't a test of Potiphar's loyalty or Potiphar's faith. This is a test of Joseph's faith. Now, he could have struggled as his hands were being tied, maybe tied behind his back with a strong rope. He could have shouted, trying to let the truth be heard by the keeper of the prison or by Potiphar. He could have also, once he was put into prison, he could have withdrawn to himself. He could have become bitter over the way things seemed to be working out. God had brought him this far. Why was he allowing him to be taken into prison? Probably, if you're tracking things, why would God allow that? Why would God allow his people to be taken prisoner for something they didn't do? Now, it's easy to get into that mindset when we see things not working out, when we become discouraged because things didn't work out the way that we intended them to, or when people don't react the way that we think they should or we know that they should. For Joseph, this was a test of his faith in God. His God had been with him through this whole ordeal. He had been with him every step of the way. I bet that his dreams were on his mind. Was God going to fulfill those dreams? Or had he decided that those dreams were merely dreams, empty dreams? Would God, in fact, bring him out of prison? Would he raise him up? And did Joseph believe that God would give those blessings to him, like he had given blessings to his father Jacob, who had started out essentially with nothing, running away from his family, from his brother who wanted to kill him? Maybe there's a pattern there in this family here. Now, in that moment, in that prison, by himself with nothing, maybe they gave him a new robe. Don't know. But he essentially had nothing. Joseph had again to rely completely on God to be faithful to him. Joseph had to rely on God's faithfulness even when he couldn't see a way out. Verse 21 here in Genesis 39. But the Lord was with Joseph. We see this fantastic truth, this comforting truth. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. God made him successful even in the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever they did there, it was his doing. He was running the place. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Now, it doesn't mention the keeper of the prison's bread, but I'd imagine that Joseph didn't have to worry. Maybe that's the only thing that the keeper of the prison had to worry about. Joseph set a wonderful example here of remaining faithful to God, as well as a positive attitude in a seemingly hopeless situation. Now, there's sometimes where we know that God will see us through, but we still become discouraged at our present situation because it seems hopeless, even though we know that God's working something out. But Joseph, did he just sit down and wait to die in prison? He could have done that. He could have said, well, I guess this is my lot in life now. And here he is sitting in this place. Who knows if it's a dark, dreary place filled with all kinds of people guilty of all kinds of evils. Although it kind of doesn't sound like that kind of prison necessarily. But, there are potentially some bad people in there. Well, he didn't just sit down and wait to die. He didn't just sit down and wait for some huge miracle either. He got to work. He got to work serving diligently, even in prison. He became a servant there, or he continued to be a servant there. I can only imagine that it started out with just small tasks, little things, not any big gestures, probably sweeping the floor without being asked or something like that, taking out the trash, helping people out. And then Joseph was given more and more responsibility until he was practically running the place. Our test of faith, our faith is tested very often. And when things seem hopeless, do we just shut down and begin to question God in those moments? Do we become bitter and angry at others because we don't see things working out the way that we know that they should, or we think that they should, or because others can't see what we see in ourselves? Or do we have faith that God will be there, just as he was there for Joseph and just as he has been here for us all along? Do we recall the fact that faith without works is dead? Do we continue moving forward, actively demonstrating our faith? God expects us to continue forward, even during difficult tests and trials. Just because something's hard doesn't mean that we have to stop, or that we're expected to stop doing what God expects us to do. Do we have faith that God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him in their lives? God has many promises laid out for us. Do we have faith, even when the situation around us seems very difficult, that God will give us those promises in due time? Now, this whole situation with Joseph reminds me of 1 Peter Chapter 2. We can turn over there. Maybe we'll hold our place in Genesis. 1 Peter Chapter 2. Verse 19, it says, "For this is commendable, if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently?" If we're guilty of something and we receive correction, then that's justified. "But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God." And we see that Joseph seemed to understand that fact. He had faith that God was going to bring him out of there. And God knows the truth of the situation. Now, the third test that we have, that we see Joseph go through back in Genesis, is a test of kindness. A test of kindness. So we'll turn back to Genesis. Now, in this part of the story here, there are two officers who served under Pharaoh. They served Pharaoh directly. Very important men. They had very important jobs in the kingdom of Egypt. Now, the world they lived in was different than ours in some respects. I mean, definitely a different location. I don't know if they have snow in Egypt very often. But the world that they lived in meant that if they angered their boss, if they angered Pharaoh, he could throw them directly into prison. No questions asked, just like what happened to Joseph. And that's exactly what happened. They made the Pharaoh angry for some reason, and these two men were placed in prison, the same prison where Joseph was. As we're reading through this story, we get the sense that, oh, okay, I see what God has going on here. I see him working things out. Let's see how it plays out. Now, part of the duties that Joseph had included watching over the other prisoners, caring for the other prisoners who were in this prison. And it seems that he was attentive to their needs. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have had as much responsibility as he had been given. Now, it would have been easy for him to just pass by these new prisoners and say, well, there they are. They probably did something terrible. I don't want to talk to them, and just walk on. They were strangers. They were guilty of something. They were in this prison, potentially evil men. Why would he want to try to help them out? Now, this was a test for Joseph in this situation, in his ability to be kind, even in a difficult place, with difficult people in it. That's a test of kindness here. Genesis 40, we pick up this story. Genesis 40, we'll start in verse 5. And we see these very important jobs that these men had. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream. Both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. In verse 6, and Joseph came into them. So we see this attention here. In the morning, and he looked at them and saw that they were sad. He could have just walked on by. Well, they're probably sad because, well, they're in prison. They've done something terrible. He could have done that. But what does he do here? Verse 7. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his Lord's house, saying, why do you look so sad today? It's just something simple. But it's a simple act of kindness here that he's offering to these men. Why do you look so sad? Just a little bit of attention here. He put an extra touch into his work. And we know that God was using this situation. He was using these men for his own purposes. We know that. And I think Joseph might have realized that fact, but only after he had found out that they were upset over dreams. And maybe he started thinking, I wonder if this is something from God. He knew he had that connection with dreams all his life. He had dreams. And God had given him special dreams and special understanding of dreams. But without this kindness, Joseph wouldn't have been able to understand that fact or see that God was working with these men. And we also see humility in Joseph. So Joseph passed that test of kindness, but we also see humility in Joseph. He doesn't take credit for the interpretation of dreams. Of course, he knew that if he did try to take credit, then God could, keep him in prison, throw him out, have him killed, whatever he wanted. He knew that. And so he didn't take credit, and he was also truthful. He gave a truthful interpretation of the dreams. He didn't try to hide anything, even if it was terrible news. And for one of these men, it was terrible news. Verse 8, as we continue on with this story. And they said to him, we each have a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. So Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. He's the only one around there who worships the true God. And God is working with him. Well, then they tell him the dreams that they had. Now for one of these men, it was great news. He was going to be delivered out of prison. The other one, it was terrible news. He was going to be killed. And we see that Joseph was kind to these strangers, even in an uncaring place, taking time to help in this moment of need, this moment of sadness. Now, he had hoped to be remembered for interpreting those dreams by the man, the butler who was released from prison. But that's not why he did this. He didn't do this for selfish reasons, but he'd hoped that would be the case. He wondered, perhaps, if that's how God was going to get him out of prison. And maybe, if that butler had immediately gone to Pharaoh and told him everything, then maybe Joseph would be taken out of prison immediately and brought back out to serve under Pharaoh, to be successful in whatever he did. Now, our test of kindness, our kindness is tested often, our willingness to be kind. How often do we have opportunities to be kind, but we don't take it? Sometimes we get busy with things and it's easier to ignore people. Or sometimes we choose to be harsh because we don't think that the other person deserves to be treated with respect. And we do that sometimes, whether we mean to or not. Our God is far more patient, kind with us than we ever deserve. We aren't deserving of that patience, of that kindness, but he shows it to us. We are to become like him. We are to become people who are kind. It seems like such a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but it's so important. It's an element of God's own character. Our ability to be kind to others is constantly tested in every interaction that we have, whether it's in person, on the internet, over the phone. Some people still write letters, and that's an opportunity to choose to be kind These are all potentials for acts of kindness, opportunities potentially to show kindness to others, even if we don't feel like somebody else deserves it. Because there's sure somebody else out there that thinks that we aren't deserving of kindness either. And we're not. We already understand that. But we are to be people who are kind. And our kindness, our ability to be kind, our willingness to be kind is often tested. Now the fourth test that we see Joseph go through is a test of patience. The final words that Joseph spoke to the chief butler as he was released from prison was a plea for this man to remember him. In verse 14 of this same chapter, he says, "But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me." And he's hoping that maybe this is how God wants it to be worked out. I'll ask this guy to show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. So he calls it a house. Maybe it's not, such a prison as sometimes we think, but it was still a place where there were people kept against their will, whether they were guilty or not. And we see here that almost immediately the butler forgets. In verse 15 here, we'll read, it says, "For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews." This is the only part where we see Joseph expressing any kind of maybe concern for his situation. Maybe he was afraid at this moment. This is the only place where he expresses this. The rest of the time, we don't have words from him. We don't know. It kind of seems like he was very, very patient. But here, maybe there's a touch of impatience here. Maybe he's trying to push the situation a little bit because he doesn't know exactly how God is going to work this out. So he says, "He was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon." So it's a little more than just a house. It's a dungeon. It's a place where people are kept. Of course, in his excitement, that butler quickly forgot this kind stranger. And Joseph stayed locked in prison, diligently serving for another 2 years. Another 2 years. We don't know how long he was in there before. Now, some of this story seems to go by relatively quickly, but I think the whole story takes longer than it seems to. So we don't know how long he was in prison. Had to have been there for at least some time to be able to work his way up to this fantastic position that he was in. Although we know that God moved things along very quickly. But then he was stuck in this prison another 2 years. And this was a test of Joseph's patience. Because he was probably thinking that maybe God's going to get me out here just in a couple days. As soon as that butler gets back, he gets cleaned up out of prison, he's back at work, he'll talk to the Pharaoh. I'll be out of here. There are times when Joseph did see God working immediately in his life. But he was learning through this experience that God has his own timing for everything. God has his own timing that is not always our timing. In fact, it's very rarely our timing. God has his own timing. Now, God has very precise timing, in fact. It takes into consideration so many different factors that when we're trying to figure out when things should happen or how soon we should do things or when we get impatient, we don't consider every factor. We're just thinking about mostly what's right in front of us, what we can see. Well, God sees everything, and so he considers every single factor. And we can speculate that if Joseph had gotten out of prison immediately, he would have been successful at whatever he did next. But God needed him for a greater purpose. God had greater things planned for him than going back and serving, under another high official in the land of Egypt. God needed Joseph for greater things than being set free so that he could return to his family, even. And that's something hard to swallow. It must have been for Joseph. God's timing is perfect, and so are his plans for us, just like they were perfect for Joseph. Our patience is often tested. Patience is kind of a funny thing, I think. Sometimes I consider myself a patient person, but then I think, why do I get so upset so easily, so often? I thought I was more patient than that. And we're often patient for a little while. It's easier to be patient for a little while. But we struggle with the concept of suffering for a long time. Now, patience and long suffering are very related. We're going to mostly stick with talking about patience, but long suffering is kind of included in there. Sometimes we have difficulty suffering through a difficult situation for a long time, or suffering through the presence of certain people for any length of time. That's a test of our patience. Now, pride is an enemy of patience. Pride is an enemy of a lot of things. Pride makes us think that we have better things to do. Pride makes us think that we don't have time for another person, what they have going on. It makes us think that if it were up to us, we could get things done quicker and better than somebody else, or even better than God can do things. Pride can do that to us as well. And that's when we start to become impatient with things. We start to squirm around. We start to question God's faithfulness. And we must be careful to realize that God works things out in His time for our good. Let's hold our place in Genesis. Let's turn to Romans chapter 8 in the New Testament. I already had my hand there. Wow. Sometimes it works out that way. Romans chapter 8. This is one of those beautiful reminders that's supposed to encourage us, to give us strength, to give us patience in everything that's happening to us. Romans 8, verse 28 says, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose." If we love God, we're going to be patient. We're supposed to be becoming a patient people. Patience is about being able to let go over something, let go control over something or someone. That's very difficult for us to do, especially when we feel helpless or lost or like we're running out of time. Patience is being able to let go control over something when it isn't our place to have control over it or over somebody else. And that's obviously easier said than done. We can talk about it all day, but living life, that's the real test of our patience. Now, the fifth test of wisdom, I didn't tell you in the beginning how many tests I had, just in case, but we'll probably make it through all of them, I suppose. The fifth test is a test of wisdom. This is another test that Joseph went through, a test of wisdom. Joseph's reputation here for being an interpreter of dreams, it was supposed to precede him. And it did eventually when the butler remembered that simple act of kindness. That act of kindness, if Joseph didn't succeed in that test, then he wouldn't have been brought before Pharaoh. But because of that act of kindness, because of the miracle of interpreting dreams which came from God, this simple young man was brought before a king. Now, Genesis 41, let's turn back to Genesis now. We see as we continue on with this story, Genesis chapter 41, starting in verse 9. "Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, 'I remember my faults this day.'" 2 years later, he finally remembers. And we see it's because Pharaoh had a dream. And he recounts the events of the story to Pharaoh. Pharaoh probably doesn't even remember that it happened. He has a lot of things going on in his life. But he reminds him, "Remember when you were angry? You were angry at me and the baker, and you threw us into custody. You threw us into prison. Well, there was this guy there, this young Hebrew." This is in verse 12. It mentions this Hebrew man, a servant of the captain of the guard. "And we told him that we had dreams, and he interpreted the dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dreams. And it came to pass just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him." A poor baker. Well, who knows? We don't know if he deserved it or not, but that's what happened to him. And this is evidence of Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. Now Joseph is brought before Pharaoh after a quick shave and a change of clothes. That's the third outfit that he has in this story. He gave credit to God for the interpretation of the dream. And he eases Pharaoh's mind here about things. He told him that God would bring him an answer of peace. It says in verse 16. He gives God the credit, and he brings peace to Pharaoh, comforting him. Pharaoh began telling him his vivid dream. And we actually see it's two dreams that seem to be similar but different. And Joseph explains that these are, in fact, one dream, just repeated for emphasis. In verse 32 of the same chapter. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. This is something that God has said that he's guaranteeing that it will happen by giving the dream twice. Now the interpretation was complete. And here, Joseph's wisdom is put to the test. Not just the wise advice that he offers to Pharaoh, because it was wise advice. No doubt God had given him this advice to prepare for the coming famine. But the real test of wisdom here comes in how Joseph approaches the topic, how he approaches this king. He could have flaunted his abilities and said, I'll give you what you want, but only if you give me what I want. He could have said that. He could have said, I'm going to be the best man for the job to make sure that everything works out perfectly in this plan that God has given to me. But Joseph doesn't do that. After he offers the advice to Pharaoh, he doesn't jump up and say, I'm the man for the job. He didn't try to take control. He didn't try to sound smart or to say that he was better than anybody else to do these things. That might have backfired. Here he is standing in front of the Pharaoh who he has a reputation of throwing people into prison if he doesn't like something that they do or that they say. So it would have been very unwise of Joseph to stand before a king and to just speak his own mind as he pleased. He uses wisdom in his approach to this king. Pharaoh sees this wisdom that Joseph has, not only in the task that's ahead of him to prepare for famine, but he sees this wisdom in Joseph's approach. And Pharaoh is the one that chooses Joseph for the job. Joseph here lets other people sing his praises for him. Maybe I'll give you a proverb. There's a proverb, chapter 27, verse 2, that talks about that. You can look that one up later. Proverbs 27, verse 2. Now, verse 37, let's continue on here with our story. Genesis 41, verse 37. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? They're noticing there's something different about this man and the God that he worships. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there's no one as discerning and as wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. So he puts everything in Joseph's hands. Pretty much, except for that bread that he has to bring to his mouth. Kind of like that. Except it's the throne. It's more important than bread. And so Pharaoh raises Joseph up. And God uses this whole situation to bring Joseph to the point where he wants him. No doubt everything that Joseph spoke was inspired by God. And Joseph came to understand this fact by the end of the story. And we know that if he'd foolishly tried to put himself in that prominent position, maybe he would have had some work to do for a while, but he wouldn't have gotten to that high position that Pharaoh had given him. It takes wisdom to know when to speak up and when not to speak up. And also takes wisdom to be able to approach a subject and approach a person in the right way, in a way that will be a benefit to the other person. a way that will be a benefit to the situation. It takes wisdom from God to be able to discern such things. It takes wisdom to be careful with your words when you're standing before a king or somebody who is in greater authority over you. Now, our wisdom is often tested. Wisdom is the proper application of knowledge. It's fine to know something, and there are a lot of things that we learn throughout the Bible, but knowledge isn't worth much if we don't put it to use. That's why we're supposed to be active in our faith. Godly wisdom comes from God and from the Word of God, and so we read these things so that we can gain wisdom. We can also gain wisdom from life experiences, from making mistakes. Although it's a lot better, a lot more wise to gain that wisdom from other people's experiences than from our own mistakes. And we have a lot of other people's experiences here in the Bible that we can read over, and we can say, well, they made that mistake, I'm going to try not to do that. Or they did great here, I'm going to try to do it that way. It takes wisdom to accept that in our lives. Our use of wisdom is constantly tested through the decisions that we make every single day. Whenever we open our mouth, there's an opportunity to show that we are wise or that we're foolish. And, pretty soon everybody who's listening, they're going to know one way or the other. As soon as we think that we are wise, and this is where it gets tricky, as soon as we think we are wise or we know that we are wise, that's when we get into a lot of trouble and we end up sticking our foot into our mouth. We aren't supposed to rely on our own wisdom or think that we have the most wisdom or the better wisdom. We're supposed to be seeking wise counsel from God and from those who are wise, the people that we meet, the people that know better than us. Now we're going to turn to a few Proverbs. Let's turn to Proverbs chapter 26. I'm going to wisely take a drink of my tea here. Proverbs chapter 26, in verse 4, here, this is a simple but profound bit of wisdom. It says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him." So if we're trying to argue with somebody who has a foolish argument and we're trying to bring our own wisdom in there, then we become like that fool. Verse 5 says, "Answer a fool according to his folly." It seems to almost contradict itself, but it takes wisdom to know when not to speak up and when to speak up. It says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." There is a time when we need to give an answer to someone, when the truth needs to be out there, regardless of what somebody else says. Now, it takes wisdom to know the difference. Sometimes it's hard to know the difference. It takes practice, it takes guidance from God, it takes going over these Proverbs and figuring things out. This is great Christian living material here for all of us. Now, one more verse here, verse 12 of Proverbs 26. It says, "Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him." So if we think that we are more wise, it says here that there's more hope for a fool than for us. We're less wise than a fool if we think that we know everything. So our wisdom is often tested. Joseph passed his test of wisdom. Now at this point, somewhere along the story, back in Genesis, we see that Joseph is 30 years old when he stands before Pharaoh. So we see there's some time that has passed since he was taken away, sold by his brothers as a 17-year-old. He's now 30 years old. Now the sixth test, the last test that we're going to look at today that Joseph went through, is a test of pride. Remember, in the beginning there was that potential for pride. Now God, in all his wisdom, has brought Joseph to this place, to this point in his life. God has coordinated everything, worked everything out. He's made this young dreamer governor over the land of Egypt. Now, at a certain point, after 7 years of plenty, the famine begins. And It's begun to take its toll not only on the land of Egypt, but the peoples of the surrounding lands, the neighboring lands. And guess who comes to Egypt to buy grain? The story circles back around, doesn't it? Genesis chapter 42, of course we know who it is, but let's read about it here. Genesis 42 and verse 6. Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. So not only was Joseph in charge of collecting the grain in times of plenty, he was the one who delegated to who it was to be sold and how much, for how much, and all that. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. Right there we see Joseph's dreams being fulfilled right before his eyes. And he, at that moment, he knew what was going on. And Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And he starts prodding them with a few questions, trying to see how life is back home. But also he puts a little bit of pressure on his brothers there. Now this was Joseph's chance to take vengeance on them for all the trouble that they had caused him. He did put a little bit of pressure on them. He did give them maybe a small taste of what he endured. He did end up throwing them into prison for a little while. And perhaps this was part of the fulfillment of the dreams as well, humbling his brothers. But ultimately, this was done to persuade them to bring the rest of the family closer. And we see that. If we had time, we'd go through this whole story. It's a really interesting story, but we see Joseph going through this process with his brothers, trying to get the truth out from them without revealing who he is yet. Now maybe he's still trying to figure out what is all this for exactly. But maybe he's got it figured out by now. By the end, he does. But this is a test of Joseph's pride here. And pride, like we talked about before, can cause us to do all sorts of things that we wouldn't normally do if we were, maybe in a more comfortable position where that option to be prideful isn't there. It causes us to do things that we would normally do or that aren't actually good for us or for other people. That's what pride does to us. But Joseph had that chance to act on pride. He had that chance to take vengeance for what his brothers had done. They plotted to kill him, and they sold him into slavery. He could have, at that moment, taken vengeance by keeping them in prison, by letting them starve, sending them back home without food, or even having them killed. He could have done any of those things, whatever he wanted. But thankfully, Joseph wasn't out for vengeance from his brothers. He was able to overcome his pride. He was able to stand before these brothers of his, these men who had such hatred for him, and realize that he could be a benefit to these men and to the rest of his family during this difficult time. And Joseph had learned not to be a harsh dictator as he governed the land of Egypt. Above all else, he was put there to serve, and he acted that way. Now, he was the most high-paid servant in all the land, most well taken care of servant. And God used that position to bring his family into Egypt. First of all, to save their lives directly. And later on, to demonstrate God's saving power over the enemies of his people. And there are a great many spiritual lessons that have been taught that we can learn from simply because God brought his people to this land to be saved at this time. And we know that God coordinated everything. But what if pride had gotten in the way, though? What if Joseph really was trying to take vengeance on his brothers? He could have easily have kept them in prison, put them through all kinds of things. But if Joseph wasn't able to set aside his bad feelings, his pride, God wouldn't have been able to use him for this great purpose, to save his people. Now, God would have come up with some other plan, no doubt, if that's what his purpose was. But God meant to use Joseph for this successful story, for his purposes. And pride would have just gotten in the way. God would have found somebody else to use, maybe another brother. Joseph had a younger brother. Maybe that younger brother, maybe he had another coat. Doesn't say that, but maybe he had a coat too. And maybe God could have used him. But God used Joseph because he was able to pass this test of pride. Our pride is often tested. Pride inhibits us from building relationships, from loving one another. It inhibits us from doing what's best for other people and from allowing God to work with us. Our pride is constantly being tested and tried when we're being told and led by God, told what to do, how to live. When we're building relationships, our pride is tested. How often have we set ourselves aside and we think of the needs of others? I mean, there are certain situations where it's easy to do that, other situations where it's difficult. How often do we let ourselves get in the way of letting God use us for his purposes? God gives us all kinds of talents and abilities, but are we using those talents and abilities, or are we squandering them? Now that changes throughout our lives. When we're young, we have maybe a lack of certain things, more of other things. When we're young, we have lots of energy. For instance, if August was still here, he'd be running around all over the place, and that's amazing. I wish I had that energy all the time. But we have different abilities, different levels of abilities throughout our lives, but we're still expected to use those abilities and to develop them. Pride inhibits us from using them for God's purposes or pursuing things that would benefit us or benefit other people. But God's thoughts are not our thoughts. His ways are not our ways. Pride tries to convince us otherwise. Pride tries to convince us that our thoughts matter more than God's thoughts, or that our purposes, what we have going on in our lives, matter more than what God has going on in our lives. The biggest test of pride, of course, is our willingness to change when we are wrong, when we find out that we've done something wrong, or when we aren't doing what is right for another person. Even if it's okay to do, even if it's legal, is it what's right for somebody else or right for us? Pride gets in the way of repentance, and pride gets in the way of godly love. Now, Joseph was tested in many ways in his time in Egypt. He was tested in his loyalty, both to Pharaoh and to God. His faith was tested. His kindness was put to the test in a difficult place with some sketchy characters. His patience was put to the test when he was left in prison. His wisdom was put to the test when he stood before Pharaoh. And ultimately, his pride was put to the test when he stood before his brothers who hated him. But at the end of the story, Joseph finally understood the purpose behind all that had happened to him all through this time. God was coordinating his life to benefit the lives of others, not just for Joseph's sake, also for his sake. We see that stated, but not just for him, but for his family as well, and all those generations that would come after. Having understood the plans of God for us in our lives can help us succeed through tests and trials. When we see the big picture, when we see what God has going on, it can help us to grow through those trials. When we see that God must be working something out with us, even if it's just to teach us more patience. And a lot of times I think that's the case. But there's a lot of things that God has going on. Now let's finish up the end of this story, just the very end, where we see this moment where Joseph understands everything that God was working out. Chapter 45, Genesis 45, we see here that Joseph understands everything that God has done and what the purpose was. And then, if he had done it his way, things wouldn't have worked out as good as they did. Verse 5 of Genesis 45. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves. He's talking to his brothers. They're sort of kicking themselves at what happened, what they did. They're finally regretting it because they think they're in trouble or they're being punished. Because you sold me here. Don't be angry about that. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years, in verse 6, the famine has been in the land. And there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. So we see that plan that God had worked out here. These tests, these trials that Joseph went through, so that God's goodwill for his people could be done.